In February 2025, the world was rocked by news that changed the economic picture of North America. The US imposed a 25% tariff on imports from Mexico and Canada, kicking off the largest trade war in the region's history. The move, like lightning in a clear sky, caused unthinkable consequences for two of the U.S.'s largest trading partners. For Mexico, whose goods make up more than 80% of exports to America, such measures were a real challenge. Imagine Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum standing up for her people in the wake of this move and leading tens of thousands of people out to protest. But that's just the beginning. The tariffs, which have affected not only agriculture but also auto manufacturing, have been a nightmare for one of North America's key industries. So how has Mexico responded? With strategy, diplomacy, retaliation, new trade agreements. Instead of just fighting, Mexico began looking for new ways to reduce its dependence on the US by making deals with other powerful economies like China and Brazil.
Now more of my interview with President Trump. They have a $60 billion trade deficit. China has like a $300 billion last year. You said it goes up when you add it all up, it's $1 trillion.
Way over 100, Canada. And here's my problem with Canada.
But the conflict didn't end there. Canada, which has always been America's ally, is suddenly turning its back sharply on its policies. After the US doubled tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, Canada is retaliating, and the backdrop is a dramatic strengthening of economic ties with Europe. Trade between Canada and the European Union has grown by 50% since 2017, and for many in the world, it has become apparent that Canada is no longer dependent on the US. But that's not all. Canada has become not just an economic partner to Europe, but a key player in the military alliance. At this time, America is trying to bring Canada back under its control by threatening new tariffs and pressure on large corporations. But as it turns out, for most Canadians, cooperation with the US is no longer an absolute priority. So what's next? Can the US regain control of the Canadian market, or will Canada finally decide that it doesn't need to be dependent on its neighbor? And how will this affect global economic and political relations? After all, the future of North America now hangs in the balance, and every next move could be decisive. How will the world change under this new geopolitical arrangement? And what will it all ultimately benefit? Details right now, stay tuned.
Canada was meant to be the 51st state because we subsidize Canada by $200 billion a year. We don't need their cars. We don't need their lumber. We have a lot of lumber. We freed it up, as you know, last week. We're freeing it up so that you can actually cut down a tree without being, given the death penalty.
In February 2025, the world was rocked by news that shook not only the US economy, but the entire global trading system. US President Joe Biden announced the imposition of 25% tariffs on imports of goods from Mexico and Canada. This decision was the culmination of a long and arduous US trade policy aimed at protecting domestic producers and reducing dependence on foreign supplies. However, no one expected the consequences of this move to be so devastating for the entire region. Mexico, which at the time was one of the largest suppliers of goods to the US, received the measures with dismay. The country's economy, heavily dependent on exports, was jeopardized. More than 80% of Mexican goods went to the US market, and such tariffs could be a real blow to the country's entire economy. Mexico's response was not long in coming. President Claudia Sheinbaum, even before officially announcing her reaction, began to convene urgent meetings with economists and politicians to come up with a plan to protect the country's interests. As a result, in just a few days, Mexico brought hundreds of thousands of people onto the streets, organizing massive protests in Mexico City's Central Plaza. Banners with slogans such as "Mexico deserves respect" and "No to tariffs" became a symbol of resistance. Against this backdrop, President Sheinbaum issued an official statement emphasizing that the country would not tolerate economic threats from its largest neighbor. This protest was not just an act of civil disobedience, but a political manifesto designed to show the world that Mexico was willing to fight for its economic independence.
Because what these radical environmentalists have done to our country, but we freed it up. But we don't need their lumber. We don't need their energy. We don't need anything. We certainly don't want their automobiles. They make a lot of millions of automobiles are sent in. I'd rather have them made in Michigan. I'd rather have them made in South Carolina or any one of our...
But you're tougher with Canada than you are with some of our biggest adversaries.
Only because it's meant to be our 51st state.
Okay, but
but listen to this for a second.
We need their territory. They have territorial advantage. We're not going to let them get close to China.
Look, right? I deal with every country, indirectly or directly.
However, reactions to such actions were far from unequivocal. In order to de-escalate the conflict and avoid total economic disaster, Sheinbaum made a strategic decision to begin negotiations with the White House. Mexico did not go for a full-scale confrontation, realizing that drastic steps could result in even greater losses. Just a few weeks later, in March 2025, President Sheinbaum personally met with representatives of the Biden administration in Washington to find a compromise. Despite many fears that the US would keep up the pressure, the talks were successful, at least for the time being. The visit resulted in a temporary success. The US government agreed to delay the imposition of new tariffs on goods covered by the USMCA agreement until April 2, 2025. This move was seen as a victory in Mexico, but it was only a partial one, and an escalation of the situation remained possible.
One of the nastiest countries to deal with is Canada. The people that, now this was Trudeau, the people that good old Justin, I call him Governor Trudeau, his people were nasty. And they weren't telling the truth. They never told the truth. You know that...
Nevertheless, the situation in the auto industry remained extremely difficult. American automakers, such as Ford, GM and Stellantis, immediately sounded the alarm, saying that raising tariffs on steel and aluminum would have disastrous consequences for the entire industry. These materials are key to automobile production, and their rise in price would inevitably affect the final cost of production. Predictions were terrible. Ford said that the price of the popular model F-150 could rise by as much as $12,000, which in conditions of economic instability could lead to a sharp decline in demand. On top of that, GM and Stellantis have begun planning production cuts, and some have even considered closing their plants. How could this affect the market? Would demand for new cars continue to grow, or would higher prices cause sales to fall?
They'd say, well, we don't charge. Well, they do. They charge tremendous. They charge tremendous. And if you look at dairy products, what they've done to our farmers, I'd go up to Iowa, I'd go up to different places, Nebraska, and they would always complain about Canada, how they get ripped off. Do you know that Canada has a 250% tariff? 250, nobody knows that. They charge us numbers that are crazy. We have a very big deficit with Canada.
Of course, this was not only a matter of economics, but also an issue that has become key to national security. Countries like Mexico play an important role in the global auto industry, supplying key components for car assembly, and any disruption in the supply chain could cause a real disaster. Problems with the supply of components have already affected car factories, which have experienced shortages of important parts. On top of that, in the same year of 2025, serious problems were announced in the production of electric vehicles. EVs were also sourced from Mexico, and these goods, as well as others, were now burdened with new duties, which inevitably raised the price of electric cars, which were already not the cheapest. All this became a real economic headache for both countries. Tariffs that at first glance were supposed to protect domestic markets began to threaten the very existence of key industries. For many Americans, especially those who were planning to buy a new car, the consequences of these decisions became tangible. Raising car prices could lead to buyers simply not being able to afford new cars, which in turn would force automakers to curtail production and cut jobs. But was this the right move? Would tariffs really save jobs in the US, or would it just create more economic problems that would affect the entire country?
And there's no reason, much more, we have much more. Just so you understand, we subsidize Canada. And I like Canada. I love Canada. I love Wayne
now
Gretzky.
The Liberal guys,
I love his wife.
The Liberal Party is going to win now in the next election, most likely. And they were down and out. But isn't that going to make them more hostile to us and possibly
I'd rather deal with a liberal than a
for
conservative.
China, closer to Canada, and that would really put us in a bind.
The conservative that's running.
Mexico did not limit itself to domestic measures, but also began to actively seek new ways to diversify its economy. By negotiating with major economic players such as China and Brazil, Mexico sought to reduce its dependence on the United States. As early as March 2025, new trade agreements were signed with several South American countries, allowing Mexico to partially offset the losses from deteriorating relations with the US. But despite these steps, the threat remained. Mexico had to decide how to keep its economy afloat in the face of a trade war with a powerful neighbor like the United States. Mexico, which found itself at the center of an economic storm after the US imposed tariffs, was not left behind. Despite a temporary agreement that avoided an immediate deterioration in relations, the Mexican economy continued to remain under pressure. As early as April 2025, it became clear that not only diplomacy but also domestic economic measures to strengthen the country's position would play a decisive role in resolving this conflict. While economists from around the world debated the implications, the Mexican authorities continued to look for ways out of the situation. One of the key steps taken by the government was an expanded package of measures to support the national economy. In particular, the Mexican government initiated large-scale reforms in the sphere of tax legislation aimed at stimulating domestic production and creating new jobs. Also, in order to reduce dependence on US markets, the country adopted a policy of strengthening ties with other economic regions, including Latin America and Asia. But the problem remained: a key industry, the automobile industry, was under threat. Mexico, which supplied the US with a significant amount of cars and auto components, found that higher tariffs on steel and aluminum not only increased the cost of production, but also threatened the jobs of tens of thousands of people. During January and February 2025, a number of major auto plants, such as GM and Ford plants, were forced to cut production by 30% to cope with rising material costs. Against this background, a new scandal has erupted inside Mexico. It became known that several major car companies operating in the country, in order to optimize costs, began to close plants that were engaged in the production of not only cars, but also critical components for their assembly. This sparked massive protests among workers, especially in large industrial zones such as Guerrero and Mexico City. Workers demanded that the government not only protect their jobs, but also introduce government subsidies to maintain production capacity.
He's stupidly no friend of mine. I don't know him, but he said negative things. So when he says negative things, I couldn't care less. I think it's easier to deal, actually, with a liberal. And maybe they're going to win, but I don't really care. It doesn't matter to me at all.
So your end game is what with them?
My end game is I don't want to have a big deficit.
In response to this wave of discontent, Mexico decided to hold a series of negotiations with large multinational companies, including Tesla and other electric car manufacturers, to shift production to cleaner and more technologically advanced modes of transportation. The talks took place amid growing concerns about the impact of tariffs on the development of the electric vehicle market, which has been in a strong growth phase in the US and Mexico in recent years. Electric cars, previously considered expensive, were now becoming even less affordable for consumers due to higher component prices, particularly for batteries and motors sourced from Mexico. This created serious problems for both manufacturers and consumers. The Mexican authorities, realizing the importance of this sector for the country's economy, announced the creation of new tax incentives for companies involved in the production of electric cars and components for them, which was supposed to stimulate the development of this industry and minimize the impact of the trade war. Meanwhile, in the United States, the situation also continued to deteriorate. US economists began sounding the alarm about the possible long-term effects of the tariffs on US consumers and manufacturers. Higher material costs, as well as supply chain disruptions, threatened to delay production processes and increase the cost of final products. For industries such as automobiles, the situation was becoming critical. In response, some US automakers began negotiating with Mexican companies about possibly transferring some production to Mexico, where labor and production costs remained lower than in the United States. This decision was something of a revelation of sorts, as such moves were politically and economically impossible before the tariffs were imposed. However, domestic issues continued to be on the agenda. With trade wars with the US and growing economic instability, the Mexican government was forced to take serious measures to maintain social stability. As a result, Funding for the social assistance program was increased in 2025, and a fund was created to support those who lost their jobs during the economic crisis. These measures avoided social tensions, but the government realized that long-term prosperity required not only diversification of the economy, but also sustainable domestic production, which remained the most important challenge for the country in the face of global economic changes. After the imposition of tariffs on goods from Canada in February 2025, the situation between the US and Canada deteriorated sharply. The US, expecting that Canada would not be ready to respond to aggression, was wrong. Already on March 12th of that year, Canada announced retaliatory measures, imposing 25% tariffs on $21 billion of US goods, including steel, aluminum, and key agricultural products. Canada hit the areas that were most important to US producers, but at the same time, these measures also affected millions of consumers who now pay higher prices for groceries and everyday goods. Moreover, in response to the new tariffs, the Canadian government announced a strategic move to reduce dependence on the United States. While the US had previously been Canada's most important trading partner, the strategy of bilateral cooperation with the European Union was a new milestone in Canadian foreign policy. The very fact that Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney did not go to Washington, but went straight to London and Paris was for many a significant symbol of a new era in Canadian diplomacy. According to sources close to the government, Carney framed the new strategy as a pivot to the East that not only includes new trade agreements, but also military cooperation. The Canadian Prime Minister made it clear that Canada is no longer going to be dependent on the US and is ready to develop its economic and strategic relations with Europe. Already by mid-2025, thanks to active engagement with the EU, Canada has significantly increased its exports to Europe, turning the European Union into its third-largest trading partner, ahead of even China. But Canada's actions were not limited to economic measures. The most important part of its new strategy was the active expansion of military cooperation with the European Union. In 2025, Canada became a full participant in the PESCO, Permanent Structured Cooperation, military project, allowing it to expand its presence in European security. This change was an important step towards strengthening Canada's global role. As part of its cooperation with the EU, Canada also increased its military power in the Baltic region, where it actively participated in joint exercises with NATO and European allies. In 2025, Canada led NATO exercises in Latvia, which strengthened its role in defending Europe from external threats. Also that same year, Canada was invited to increase its participation in the EU's Common Intelligence Network, significantly improving cyber defense and enhancing the country's economic security. The strategy was not only to expand its military position, but also to strengthen its diplomatic and commercial influence in Europe. Meanwhile, the US was beginning another round of tensions related to the effects of the imposed tariffs. In response to Canadian countermeasures, the White House attempted to increase pressure on Canada by threatening new tariff increases on automobiles and other goods. However, the US actions did not have the expected effect. On the contrary, they accelerated a process in which Canada increasingly moved away from economic dependence on the United States. Statistics from 2025 showed that Canada increased its exports of goods to Europe by 50%, almost offsetting the losses from the tariffs imposed by the US. Trade flows with the EU increased significantly and Canada was able to secure significant concessions under new agreements, further strengthening its foreign market position. However, the US continued to exert pressure, especially on major Canadian partners. In July 2025, several US corporations, such as Ford, began publicly expressing their displeasure with tariff increases and threats from the White House. Despite this, Prime Minister Carney did not give in to pressure and continued to pursue a European pivot policy. Canada strengthened its cooperation with Germany and Britain, and soon signed several large contracts to supply Canadian oil and gas to Europe. This move further strengthened Canada's position on the international stage and signaled to the US that it might lose not only its role as a crucial partner, but also its economic influence over Canada. At the same time, the Canadian government began to actively diversify its supply to other parts of the world. In 2025, Canada strengthened its cooperation with South Korea and Japan by concluding several strategic agreements related to the exchange of high technology and investment in the energy sector. Statistics showed that Canada significantly increased its exports to Asia, a process that became the foundation of its strategy to reduce its dependence on the United States. This was especially important in the context of global economic instability caused by the tariff war. The situation in the US, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly tense. President Biden, realizing that he could not afford to lose Canada as a key partner, began taking desperate steps to bring the country back into the orbit of US policy. However, despite threats to raise tariffs on Canadian goods, Canada stood firm, showing that it was willing to fight for its independence and economic security. More and more Canadians, according to polls, have begun to look to Europe as a reliable ally. 68% of Canadians expressed the view that the European Union is a more attractive partner than the US, and 44% said Canada should seriously consider becoming part of the EU. For the US, this turnaround has come as a blow. The loss of the Canadian market to the EU meant a significant weakening of American influence in North America. In a political context, the reverberations of this economic conflict began to reverberate in the US elections. Democrats actively used this issue in their election campaign, accusing Republicans of incompetence on foreign trade and international relations. In particular, a number of Democratic leaders said that Biden's tariff policy had led to a deterioration of relations with key partners, and this could be a disaster for the country's economy. Canada, for its part, realized that this new strategic stance could have lasting consequences for the entire continent. While the US economy was gradually recovering from the blows caused by domestic political decisions, Canada, capitalizing on its new economic independence, continued to steadily pursue its course. Economic cooperation with Europe, diversification of foreign trade, and a stronger role in international security were becoming top priorities for the country, and these steps appeared to be key to its future on the world stage.